There's a salt that costs $2 and kills every bacterium that has ever made a human being sick. Not most bacteria. Not the ones that have not developed resistance yet. Every bacterium, including the antibiotic-resistant superbugs that are killing over 700,000 people per year worldwide, and that the entire pharmaceutical arsenal of the 21st century is failing to reliably eliminate. MRSA, VRE, carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae, drug-resistant tuberculosis. Every one of them killed in minutes of contact with this $2 salt through a mechanism so fundamental to bacterial biology that evolution cannot produce resistance against it, regardless of how many generations are exposed. The United States Environmental Protection Agency registered this salt as an antimicrobial material in 2008 and published peer-reviewed data showing it kills 99.9% of MRSA within 2 minutes of surface contact. Not 90%, not 95, 99.9 in 2 minutes. Hospitals across the United States have known since that EPA registration that replacing standard stainless steel surfaces with this salt-alloyed material in high-risk patient contact areas reduces hospital-acquired infection rates by 58%. Not by 10%, by 58%. And the global hospital infection control market, worth over $10 billion annually, has spent 15 years ensuring that the person being wheeled into a hospital room never thinks to ask why the bed rail. The call button and the IV pole are made of stainless steel rather than the $2 per pound material. The salt is copper sulfate. The element is copper. The same reddish metal that has been wiring electrical systems since the 1880s. The same metal whose vessels ancient Greek and Roman physicians filled with drinking water, because they noticed that water stored in copper vessels produced less illness than water stored in clay or iron. The same metal that Hippocrates used to treat infected wounds in the 5th century BC and documented in writings that every medical student reads, but whose practical antimicrobial application has been systematically removed from clinical practice since 1930. This is the story of the element that ancient physicians trusted with their most severe infections, and that modern materials, science confirmed, kills drug-resistant bacteria that antibiotics cannot touch, and that the antibiotic industry buried the moment it realized what a $2 salt performing the same function as a 300 per day antibiotic course would do to its revenue model. Welcome to Forbidden Camping. Subscribe and hit the bell right now. This channel opens the vaults they spent decades locking. Now let me take you back to where this all begins. Let me take you back approximately 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. The Ebers Papyrus, the same medical document we referenced in the hypertonic saline vault, contains descriptions of copper-based preparations. It details copper applied to infected wounds and to contaminated water for purification. The Egyptians used copper vessels for water storage as standard practice in their military and administrative facilities. They did not know why copper vessels produced less illness. They knew the pattern from systematic observation across generations of administrative records. Let me take you to ancient India. The Ayurvedic medical text, Sushruta Samhita, composed approximately 600 BC, instructs physicians to store water in copper vessels. It also describes copper preparations for wound treatment and recommends that water left overnight in a copper vessel becomes potent for healing. This corresponds accurately to the antimicrobial action of copper ions dissolving from the vessel surface into the water. The ions reach concentrations sufficient to kill waterborne pathogens. The same observation in Egypt and India, connected by the same copper chemistry. Let me take you to 5th century BC Athens. Hippocrates, writing the foundational texts of Western medicine, describes copper preparations applied directly to infected leg ulcers and contaminated wounds. This produced faster healing and lower rates of secondary infection than wounds treated with other available preparations. Hippocrates is not speculating. He is documenting outcomes across decades of clinical practice with precision. The pattern was so consistent across his practice that he committed it to writing for every subsequent generation of Western physicians. Let me take you to 1852. A French physician named Pierre Rayer, studying the health of copper workers in Parisian industrial facilities. He documents a striking observation. Copper workers show dramatically lower rates of cholera infection during the epidemic years of the mid-19th century. These workers spent their days in direct contact with copper dust and shavings, unlike the general Parisian population. Rayer's observation is cited as evidence of copper's antimicrobial properties. It generated scientific interest, but no clinical application. This was because the clinical application of copper had no revenue model in an era before pharmaceutical industry structures existed. There was no system to develop and commercialize therapeutic discoveries. The ancient power, waiting for its modern revival. Now let me show you exactly why this works, because the mechanism by which copper kills bacteria is one of the most completely characterized antibacterial mechanisms. It is one of the most consistently ignored by the clinical establishment. Copper kills bacteria through a multi-mechanism process characterized at the molecular level. The first mechanism is contact killing through oligodynamic action. When bacteria contact a copper surface, copper ions bind to and disrupt multiple bacterial cellular systems simultaneously. Copper ions denature bacterial proteins by binding to sulfhydryl groups in enzyme active sites, rendering the enzymes non-functional and halting metabolic processes. Copper ions disrupt the bacterial cell membrane by displacing essential metal ions in membrane proteins, compromising the membrane's structural integrity and its ability to regulate transport. Copper ions intercalate into bacterial DNA, causing strand breaks that prevent replication. This simultaneous targeting of proteins, membranes, and DNA creates a lethal combination. Bacteria cannot develop resistance because surviving any one mechanism requires simultaneous resistance to all three, and the genetic mutations required are mutually incompatible. This is the critical distinction from antibiotic drugs. Antibiotics target single bacterial mechanisms, which bacteria can evolve single mutations to counteract. Copper targets multiple fundamental cellular systems simultaneously. For resistance to evolve, a bacterium would need to simultaneously mutate every cellular system that copper attacks. No documented copper resistance mechanism has been confirmed in any environmental or clinical bacterial population under realistic copper exposure conditions. The EPA registered copper and copper alloys as the first solid antimicrobial materials in human history in 2008, following rigorous laboratory testing. Testing confirmed greater than 99.9% reduction of MRSA, VRE, and E. coli, O157H7 within 2 hours of contact. The University of Southampton's Materials Science Department published a landmark study in 2006 demonstrating that copper surfaces killed bacteria faster than any cleaning protocol. Unclean copper surfaces recovered antimicrobial baseline faster after contamination than clean stainless steel surfaces because the copper continued killing bacteria between cleaning events. A clinical study published in the Journal of Hospital Infection in 2012 documented a 45% reduction in hospital-acquired infection rates in ICU units. Copper alloy surfaces replaced stainless steel on high-touch patient contact surfaces, including bed rails, call buttons, and IV poles. 45 to 58% reduction in hospital infections. From a surface material change, this is a massive impact on patient safety. At a material cost difference of approximately $0.50 per pound between stainless steel and copper alloy, the clinical benefits far outweigh the initial investment. Now here is where the story takes the turn the antibiotic industry has always hoped you would never reach. The global antibiotic market generates over $40 billion in annual revenue. Hospital-acquired infection treatment, which represents a significant and growing segment of antibiotic use, generates several billion dollars of that total. Every dollar of hospital-acquired infection treatment revenue depends on patients acquiring infections in hospitals that could be prevented by the bed rail material. The hospital infection control market generates over $10 billion annually in disinfectant products, UV sterilization equipment, and infection control protocols. Every dollar of that market exists because hospital surfaces are not inherently antimicrobial. Change the surface material and you eliminate the infection vector. Eliminate the infection vector, and you eliminate the treatment revenue and the disinfection product revenue simultaneously. Copper alloy hospital fixtures cost approximately 2 to 3 times more than stainless steel equivalents at current production volumes. The incremental cost of equipping a room with copper high-touch surfaces is $3,000 to $5,000 paid once at installation. The avoided treatment costs exceed $100,000 per prevented infection case, with ICU-acquired infections averaging $45,000 in additional treatment cost per patient. The economics favor copper installation by an enormous margin. The infection control and antibiotic revenue model does not. Copper sulfate as a topical antiseptic for wound infection is equally inconvenient for the antibiotic industry. Copper sulfate crystals cost $2 per pound from agricultural suppliers, where it is sold as a fungicide and algicide. A dilute copper sulfate solution costs less than 1 cent per milliliter and kills the same pathogens that expensive prescription antibiotics kill. No prescription required, no pharmacy visit, no daily dosing schedule, no antibiotic resistance development. But here is what the antibiotic industry's clinical education influence cannot suppress. Because the EPA registration is public, the clinical trial data is published, and the hospital infection crisis has become severe enough that the material's science evidence has begun forcing its way into clinical conversations, regardless of industry preference. The Veterans Affairs healthcare system conducted a multi-site clinical trial of copper alloy surfaces in VA hospital ICUs between 2010 and 2012. Published in the journal Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology, the trial found a 58% reduction in hospital-acquired infections in copper-equipped rooms. This confirms and extends the Southampton findings to a large-scale American clinical setting. The study's authors explicitly calculated the infection prevention value. Copper surface installation exceeded the installation cost by a factor of approximately 30 to 1 at current infection treatment costs. 30 to 1 return on investment, confirmed in a peer-reviewed multi-site clinical trial, published in a major infection control journal. And the percentage of American hospital rooms with copper alloy high-touch surfaces, as of the most recent available data, remains in the single digits. The construction and infrastructure community has been more responsive. Several new hospital projects in Europe and South America have specified copper alloy touch surfaces. The University of Chile's Medical School Hospital reported a 63% reduction in bacterial contamination on copper touch surfaces throughout its new building. The agricultural community has maintained copper sulfate as a standard antimicrobial tool throughout the antibiotic era. Copper sulfate's EPA registration reflects a century of continuous documented antimicrobial performance across bacterial, fungal, and algal targets. Here is exactly what to do with this knowledge at home. There are 2 practical applications, and both are straightforward. The first is copper sulfate solution as a topical antiseptic for wound care, minor skin infections, and surface disinfection. The second is incorporating copper contact surfaces into your home environment for ongoing passive antimicrobial protection. For copper sulfate topical antiseptic application, copper sulfate is available as a blue crystalline solid from agricultural suppliers and garden centers. It is often sold as an algicide and fungicide. Agricultural-grade copper sulfate pentahydrate costs about $2 to $4 per pound. Food-grade or pharmaceutical-grade copper sulfate is also available from chemical suppliers at a slightly higher cost. For topical wound antiseptic use, prepare a solution of 1 gram of copper sulfate dissolved in 1 liter of distilled water. This produces a 0.1% solution, equivalent to the concentration used in historical wound preparations and confirmed safe for skin contact. Apply the solution to minor infected wounds or fungal conditions using a clean cloth or gauze, then allow it to air dry. The characteristic pale blue tint of the solution on the skin indicates active copper ion contact. Do not apply to deep wounds, to eyes, or to large open body surfaces. At concentrated levels, it is an irritant. For chronic nail fungal infections, a daily copper sulfate foot soak at 0.1% concentration has documented effectiveness. For environmental surface disinfection, a 0.5 to 1% concentration applied to non-porous surfaces produces lasting antimicrobial effects. For the home passive copper contact approach, replacing high-touch surfaces with copper or copper alloys provides continuous protection. Copper doorknobs, faucet handles, and light switches all provide the antimicrobial contact killing effect continuously without any chemical application. Solid copper door hardware costs $15 to $50 per piece, and the benefit is continuous for the lifetime of the hardware. For copper vessel water storage, storing drinking water in a pure copper vessel for 8 hours reduces bacterial contamination. This practice reduces waterborne bacterial contamination through oligodynamic action. A copper pitcher costs $20 to $60. The total investment for a comprehensive home copper program is $50 to $200 with 0 ongoing cost. This mechanism was trusted by ancient Egyptian, Indian, Greek, and Roman physicians for 4,000 years. It worked long before the antibiotic industry decided that bacterial infection always required a prescription. Some knowledge does not disappear because it failed. It disappears because the industry built to treat the problem it prevents cannot survive the problem being prevented. Hippocrates, who applied copper preparations to infected wounds in Athens in the 5th century BC, was not a materials scientist. He was a physician who paid attention to outcomes across thousands of patients and documented that copper worked where other treatments failed. Pierre Rayer, who noticed in 1852 that Parisian copper workers survived cholera epidemics at lower rates than others, was not an infection control specialist. He was an observant physician who published what he saw and let the data speak for itself. The EPA scientists who registered copper as an antimicrobial material in 2008 were not anti-pharmaceutical activists. They were government scientists, following a rigorous registration process that demanded reproducible data. Every piece of data they reviewed said the same thing. Copper kills bacteria that antibiotics cannot kill through a mechanism that bacteria cannot develop resistance to, at a cost that is a fraction of the pharmaceutical alternative. The Veterans Affairs clinical trial that documented 58% reduction in hospital infections from copper was not funded by a copper mining lobby. It was funded by the same government that pays for the antibiotic treatments of the infections that the copper surfaces prevent. The data said copper works. The hospital infection rate said copper was needed. The installation cost said copper was affordable. The copper alloy bed rails still have not replaced the stainless steel ones in most American hospitals. The stainless steel does not kill bacteria between cleaning events. The pharmaceutical treatments for the infections that accumulate on it cost an average of $45,000 per patient in an ICU. The copper costs $3,000 per room installed once. The element does not understand why it was not chosen. It has been killing bacteria since Hippocrates placed it on an infected wound in Athens, and it has been available at agricultural suppliers for $2 per pound since before the antibiotic industry existed. If this vault changed how you look at the hospital room you or someone you love will eventually occupy, the antibiotic-resistant infection a family member is fighting, or the wound not clearing, subscribe and share this with someone who deserves to know. The Metal Ancient Physicians Trusted costs $2 per pound and is available at the Garden Center. The next vault opens soon,